The E3 podcast series focuses on various topics around real estate and facilities management. EBIZ helps organizations envision the future, enable processes and platforms, and evolve practices for continuous improvement. Our topic today is to welcome you to the inaugural E3 podcast. We plan to cover a lot of topics of fairly high level, including the impact of California's legislation on sustainability reporting requirements nationally, the importance of data governance and data standards, as well as the new OSCRE energy data standard, the importance of having an energy data standard, changes in the IWMS market and the impact on the overall picture, and finally, EBIZ 2024. I'm Tracy Jefferson, your host, and today I'll be joined by Phil Wells, the CEO of eBusiness Strategies. So Phil, welcome to the podcast. This is really exciting because it's the eBusiness Strategies inaugural podcast, and we wanted to start off the year talking about some important topics. And the first one is a big one, and that is legislation that's been happening, legislation that's pending and how it impacts things. So as we know, the U.S. government has been really reluctant for over a decade to put serious reporting requirements in place around energy. But that is really changing now because of California. California Senate Bill 253 requires companies doing business in California, not necessarily based there, but doing business in California with revenues over $1 billion to report scope 1 and 2 emissions starting in 2026, scope 3 in 2027, and these include the previous year. Now, the state has until January 1st of 2025 to totally lay out all the rules, regulations, and fine print. But at the end of the day, by January 1st of 2025, companies, they have to have their act together with data gathering around energy in order to meet this requirement. And that's only one example. We know that other states are looking at things. The federal government now is going to have to get involved because the different states will have different rules. But this all impacts not only states or even the United States, but potentially global companies. And so, Phil, I'm curious your thoughts on this subject, because to me, this was huge in 2023, and the impact on 2024 is going to be immeasurable almost.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tracy. And I too join in welcoming people to this. It's a great way to kick off the new year. And we're excited about being able to provide value to those who tune into the podcast. So I find it interesting. The federal government, U.S. federal government, and 3-4 years ago came out with their draft ESG regulations, and every indication was by the end of the year it was going to become law. The SEC was going to issue it, and yet they've been very quiet. We know that the rest of the world seems to be moving forward. Canada, the EU has had their corporate sustainability reporting directive in place for years. Australia has it. So we know it's coming. But this is kind of an interesting jab in the side of the federal government, because California actually issued a very positive move towards at least energy management and sustainability. And it's actually, as you mentioned, Senate Bill 253, which affects companies that make $1 billion in revenue globally, make $1 billion in revenue. They also issued around the same time the SB 261, which is the climate-related financials risk act, which affects companies that make $500,000 in revenue or more. So between those two, it's really kind of lit a fire. And we're seeing a lot more people interested in how do we get to the point where the right kind of data is being gathered and assessed. I do think the federal government now is going to have to make a move, because you're correct. We've heard of other states that are very close to issuing regulations too, and invariably there'll be some differences, which will be a struggle for the companies trying to comply. So the federal government's going to have to do something. I have been known to say that California made the Fed's regulation a moot point, but that's really not true. It's just enforcing it to become a reality.
Yeah, I think that's true. Somebody had to come along and kind of force their hand because, the federal government and with the politics involved and stuff. I think people in Congress and all were, hesitant to try to bring regulations that might not totally be popular at first, at least in business. But now we're seeing some corporate responsibility being called out with the states, and the federal government's going to have to follow. So with that in mind, but with these new standards and reporting requirements, I think that really brings into play a lot of focus on data governance and data standards. There's a lot of different sources for sustainability data, a lot of sources for energy, a lot of different kinds of devices and ways to measure things, ways for company to have to gather data to do reporting. And there's a lot of different tools out there in terms of software. But we really need to have a good data standard in play. And I think this is going to bring into almost a secondary focus that even benefits an organization well outside of just the energy and sustainability realm. And companies like OSCRE, or organizations, I should say, like OSCRE, have really been in this space for many years, and they've developed an energy standard for companies to follow. And we've had EBIZ has had a relationship with OSCRE for a long time, and can you talk a little bit about the data governance and data standards side in terms of how we work with OSCRE in the past, Phil?
Certainly, and interestingly, the inaugural meeting that kicked off what at the time was IDRC, now is Cornet, but the IDRC initiative that became OSCRE really focused on trying to put together standards so that the various software companies, when they defined a term, it was consistent. And I think space management maybe was one of the first ones they did. And that direction, though noble, was somewhat fraught with the fact that vendors didn't want to make their systems compatible so that people could switch easier between them. But in the recent years, OSCRE has really put together their data model is really good, and with the advent of the FASB IFRS data, they jumped right in initially and came up with accounting standard definition terminology and a data model so that data could be moved between various systems around that standard. And it was the start of regulated data in that model, of which now ESG is moving, particularly at this point is energy, but the E is a very aggressive part of the OSCRE standard. And that's good because there are dozens of different organizations and agencies and such that have some type of standard definition. OSCRE has instead of coming up with another one, they've actually incorporated those and said, okay, what's the best of the best, and how do we make sure that our standard will work with all those other groups? So OSCRE's done a great job of it, but in general, data governance has not been something that our industry worried too much about until maybe the accounting standards came out, because you could go look at benchmarks and the comparisons would look kind of skewed, and the difference was the way I measured rentable square feet versus the way you measured rentable square feet. The standards now have to be very precise because it's now you go to jail if you don't get it right, instead of it's, well, my numbers are different, but I know what they mean. So it's a real shift in the last few years, starting with the FASB and the IFRS, but now particularly with sustainability. Data governance and data modeling and data assessments are really critical. And we're seeing that with our clients across the board, not just with energy, but across the board. A lot more focus is being placed on understanding what the data is, assessing it, determining where there's gaps, where there's disconnects, and getting those fixed first.
Part of the thing that's intrigued me about OSCRE's energy data standard too is an emphasis not just on the technical side. They talk a lot about common vocabulary, they talk a lot about the implementation of these kinds of standards and how to make them work. And also the fact that there's more than one standard out there around, especially energy and as smart buildings. There's many standards at play depending on devices, and the different software systems you have. But OSCRE ends up being this core repository of information. And I think that's something that companies really sometimes don't understand. Everybody has their own little piece of the action. You have your own, your data owners out there. And OSCRE is really focused on bringing those data owners together. And I think something from an EBIZ standpoint, that's something that our team really focuses on we call it E3 for a reason, right? We look at how we enable and evolve different aspects of a company, and we can bring this together into something that's cohesive. I think that's fairly accurate, Phil.
It is accurate, and you're right. We've been active in. I attended that very first session many years ago, and we've been active in OSCRE for multiple years. It's good to see the recognition finally for OSCRE starting to show up in our industry. I think the standard's been good for a long time, but as I said earlier, many of our clients for years said, well, I know this is not the literal definition of how you calculate a certain particular piece of data, but we do it this way and it works for us. Well, that's starting to change. And when you look for standards, OSCRE really has done the legwork to put together, look at what is already available and how do you merge or integrate with that, instead of here's another standard, you got to pick between me and them. And with ESG, they've done a phenomenal job of defining use cases and definitions and putting together the technical side, but also how does that apply to the analytics that are going to be required, and so that you're confident that the data you're collecting across a large portfolio, particularly, is reliable and consistent and validated. So OSCRE has done a fabulous job.
Yeah, and this what you're talking about actually goes well past just the energy side of ESG. It goes into the social and governance side. It's about reporting and having auditable data, having accurate data to make good decisions. And if you're on the governance side in particular, you have potentially legal and financial liability by having inaccurate information. So that's really what this is about. It's being a corporate responsibility is very important, and corporate liability, if you're on the board of directors or at the C-suite level, it's real. So having good data and clean data and following a process and having that proper vocabulary and things like that, these are all really important. And OSCRE has the standard, and EBIZ has the background and the experience to help drive that to success. And I think that's something that's great in terms of our relationship with OSCRE itself too.
Yes, it is. And the reality is eBusiness was formed 23 years ago as a real estate strategic consulting company. And a large part of what we did was process optimization and data alignment, data analysis and alignment. So we've been doing this for a long time. Clients would typically reach out to us once they bought they always thought the solution was more technology or different technology. Well, the system I have doesn't work, I'm going to buy a new one, and it would fail. And so we would get involved because we were product agnostic consultants and to come assess why. And it was almost always the data was bad. Put garbage in, garbage out. So we had a saying, we still have a saying, it's the tools are cool, but the processes rule. And it's really the focus is on getting the business optimized and the data they need standardized. Then the technology you need it. You have to have the technology in place to actually do the job. But then it's just an enabler instead of I'm trying to fix the problem with something that I can buy off the shelf, which is a relatively lazy way of trying to solve a problem, because getting your data right can be a very costly and time-consuming activity. But again, kudos to OSCRE, and to their credit, they've been very patient for a long time, creating standards and they're on the map now because of the regulations in the last several years, starting with accounting and now with all of the ESG, and it is only going to get more so because it's so much of the focus today is on not just the environmental component, but specifically on energy consumption. And people are starting to talk about the other components. What about trash? What about the social and how do you govern in real estate? This is going to go on for quite a while, and OSCRE is at the forefront of it, and as are we. I mean, we've built out a very successful program around FASB and IFRS, and have the experts on staff that can really help people. We're doing the same thing with ESG, because realistically, ESG is not another set of data. It's data you should be tracking already. It's just, are you tracking it to the level and the standard of which it can pass compliance testing?
Yeah, and it's right. The standards is the big deal. You're having the right standards and quality. Like you say, garbage in, garbage out. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the IFRS, the gap, the things that happen around like lease accounting. That was a huge deal. They worked on the standards for a while. Then they finally said, here's the standard. And everybody was in a rush to try to get that done. In my opinion, I think what we're dealing with now with sustainability is probably going to be bigger and have more, probably more challenging timelines in some ways, and to meet the new reporting requirements. So that's one of the things that we've talked about, which is you can't wait till January 1st of 2025 and say, we're going to start gathering data. You need to be getting this done now. And I mean, Phil, I know you would have some probably strong opinions on that too, based on all the pressure around lease accounting that happened at the last minute.
Yeah, it was one of those things where we saw it was coming from 2012. We talked to our clients about it. A few of them realized early on that this was going to be a major deal. But in 2019, our workload almost doubled, and it was almost all panic implementation of lease accounting, because by 2020 they had to have it in place. We were able to get those clients up and running and the reporting done, and then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, now we got to do IFRS reporting. Can you get that done too? And we were very successful at that. But it's sure not the way I'd prefer to do it. It's saying, wait a minute, we know it's coming. Let's start doing the planning now. And we have a few people who are talking to us about the standards for around ESG, or particularly sustainability. But the thing that gets me is that the depth of the data set. We've got clients who are talking about, well, I got to track my electricity. They're talking about scope 1 and scope 2 activities under the ESG model. That will be the first thing that gets issued, but all of the standards, particularly in the California standard, it's just a year later, and you have to have scope 3. And I saw a report recently for a relatively large real estate investment company, they built buildings, and basically then they leased them, and they're way down the road. And in that report, which was beautifully done and really well clear on what the issues were in getting there, their scope 1 and scope 2 are almost totally tracked now, and they're in compliance. But they said out of the 100, if you take scope 3 is everything upstream and downstream, basically stuff that's not in your control. But it's a requirement by next year that they start reporting all of the energy being consumed downstream, that gets you building. What's the energy being consumed to make the concrete beams and ship them from their factory to the location? They're saying 3% of the total expected reporting requirements currently are covered in their scope 1 and scope 2. The rest, they haven't even got a clue yet how to figure it out. Now that's where I think companies are being a little naive, because okay, I can get my electric bills, and I can we don't generate anything on site unless they're burning natural gas for heat or boilers. But we buy stuff and we sell stuff. The perfect example is electric car. I bought an electric car, so I'm being good for the environment. Well, yeah, but do you know what it took to actually get the minerals out of the ground to build the batteries, and what the manufacturing process, how much energy was consumed to create that car, and what happens when the batteries are no longer viable and you got to dispose of them. That's all part of scope 3. And that's the part that really people need to start thinking about is what is, there's, I, I saw it's been a few months ago, I saw the big article come out about the first zero carbon building. And they were talking about operation of the building. It was not zero carbon building because they had to build it. This is intriguing for us because this is what we talk to our clients about. And at some point, whether we're ready or not, they're going to come talk to us about. So that's why we've jumped in with both feet. But it is a big deal. And California has, I think, got this right. They said, we're not going to wait. We've got to get people, if you're going to work in our state, if you're going to operate in our state, you better start putting effort behind it.
Scope 3 is going to be one heck of a challenge because it's still evolving. Exactly how you capture all that data is complex, as you said. It's not easy. It's very complicated. There's a lot of it. You can't wait and start that kind of data collection and data standardization when it's time to start gathering data for reporting. You need to do it now because there's going to be a lot of lessons learned. And it's interesting to talk about buildings too, because one of the topics for a future conversation is embodied carbon. And a lot of that is around things like buildings that release carbon over a period of time. Even if you build it as efficiently as possible, you're still going to have some carbon, especially from things like steel and concrete. And that's something we were going to be talking about in a future episode.
Yeah, it's an intriguing conversation because it's one thing to say I got my electric bills and can I make sure the data is consistent and it's measurable and I can compare it to. It's a different thing to say, do I know where everything came from that's going to go into this new building that I'm building? And all of it, and because at scope 3, they're going to report to you what their data is. And that's huge. So yeah, you might get away with waiting until you have to report on scope 1. I think scope 2 is going to be more difficult, and scope 3 is going to be very difficult.
It's interesting you say that too, because one of the emphasis in OSCRE is also talking about the procurement process because of these kinds of reporting requirements and getting this data. So let's change gears a little bit. 2023 was quite a year in the IWMS market, and that's something, of course, eBusiness is heavily involved in. And man, it is really several major players in the market had big news. We had Plan-On being acquired by Schneider. We've had Nuvolo announcing being acquired by Trane. And of course, IBM has retaken, if you will, the code to Tririga. And these are actually, these are 3 huge events in many ways. And I'm curious how you think that's going to impact the market, Phil.
Well, so just a real quick digression, because as I mentioned, we started out as a product agnostic consulting company. It has always been around technology. So from day one, it was how do we use technology? How do we track the data? What data do we need? What kind of analytics are required? And which is the best system for the client? And so we were doing the procurement activities to help them pick the right product. We started 15, 16 years ago, realized that it didn't do a lot of good to help them pick the right one if it wasn't implemented correctly. So we started doing implementation. And our assessment of products wasn't which one can we make the most money with, although clearly we're a business and we need to make money. But it was which products meet the niche in the market. And so the 3 you named, we support. There has been a lot of consolidation in the industry outside of those 3, but it is consolidation. It's buying a lot of small point solutions or various systems and then putting them under one common name umbrella. In some cases, those were integrated fairly well. In other cases, they're not integrated at all. They're just still point solutions sold by one company. But the 3 you named are the 3 leading IWMS solutions. And we're firm believers in the concept of the integrated workplace management. And so I think all 3 of those are geared to make big splashes going forward. When you're suddenly owned by a large international company that uses and supports the real estate marketplace, having your tool as part of that portfolio is huge. So I think all of those products, including the reacquisition of the source code by IBM, is a big thing. And to me, it's a validation of the concept of IWMS. I'm not opposed. We have implemented and we support companies that use point solutions. And grant you, there are really good solutions. My argument when you get into discussing those is, if you're only going to use one solution, I'd go with a point solution, because why waste the money to buy a solution that you're not going to use 4/5 of it? But the other side of that is, why buy a solution that may be incrementally better than an IWMS and then pay a fortune, not just in the technology integration between those, but in your governance program to make sure that everyone uses their independent system to the standard so that the data is reliable. And we've done large scale integrations between point solutions and set that up. But the biggest part of that is policy and governance, because if I run my system and I said, well, that's not the way I want to put it in, I'm going to change it, you can't stop me, really, because my system allows me to do it. IWMS, so those three products, again, are hugely key to, in my perspective, to how technology is going to address ESG and other items, because there is a single source of truth. It may be incrementally not quite as robust as a point solution, but I haven't seen a company yet that uses 70% of the capabilities of any tool they bought, whether it's a point solution or a big one.
Right.
But they've eliminated the need for that external, heavily vested governance model that someone has to monitor to make sure that all the data is consistent. We just did a major project over the last year for a company that it's a technology company, a global one, and they do a very good job. But they came to us because they said the guy who gets the phone call first from the CEO suite, the C-suite, becomes the source of truth, and every one of the rest of us have to get our systems to align to it. Well, that's not a good way to manage assets. And so that's why the IWMS is in my mind the way to go for any company of reasonable size with a complex portfolio. And I think those three products have put stakes in the ground to say we're going to be a major player in that market going forward because of that not just that they've got a cash flow investment, but they got it from companies that are in our market, so they know what the future is of those products.
It's interesting to see that the kind of a shift in the thought of these companies, because you have typically software companies going, well, how do we integrate with hardware and technology out there? But you've seen that flip where the technology companies are going, wait, we've got great hardware, we have great technology for buildings, but we need a platform to put all of this data together in. And that IWMS solves that. So now they're out there investing in the software side of it. It's really an interesting shift from 10, 15 years ago when it was just really the opposite of everybody. Well, we're going to try to integrate with building systems. Now it's the building system people coming in and saying, yeah, we've got this technology. We need to be able to deliver data that means something. And of course, it feeds back into our data standardization. We've got to feed data in a way that we can report, especially with sustainability coming along and ESG in general and reporting requirements. So how do we feed all this really cool data in a meaningful way, in a standardized way? So I think that you see that the Schneiders, Train, Johnson Controls bought another company, I believe. So there's all these people are lining up going, we really need the software side to make our systems the most useful. It's a really interesting philosophy now.
It is. And we've seen that all those companies are very heavy in the IoT space. And we've seen that become a reality, that it's not just, it's not nice to have everyone have some kind of intelligent devices in their network. And so getting that data into someplace and then allowing a tool, all three of those have predictive analytics. You get prediction by getting a motor telling you I've got a vibration, or an air handler saying, wait a minute, the temperature differential is too great, or so that helps you, and you don't wait for it to break. or you don't do just time-based preventive maintenance. You actually do predictive maintenance, and you say, "Oh, we better fix that. It's a critical piece of our infrastructure." But the other thing that we're starting to see creep in is intelligent decision making, and so IBM's been in this space where they own Tririga. They've built in their new version of Watson, which is Watson X. They're building that in so that you have an artificial intelligent component that can analyze data faster than you and I could, and help start saying, "Hey, whoops, there's something here you look at." I think that's going to start showing up in every major application real soon. It's whether we like it or not, artificial intelligence is here.
Right.
And our fear is that the movies that's been made for the last 10 years is also here. But I think the reality is there's an awful lot of good that it can do, because it can just shift through so much data so fast to make our jobs a little easier.
And that's very true. But AI, even AI, if you give it garbage, you're going to get garbage results, right? So it's important for us to use like an IWMS that has all this pool of data around a facility. And then that data should be out in maybe it's more of a data lake, which is, again, following like an OSCRE standard, so that we have standardized data, and AI can see things and crunch through more data than the human can. And I think it's actually going to be a huge benefit. There's a lot of people like, "Oh my gosh, AI is going to cost jobs." I think it's actually the opposite. It may change the way we work some, but for the better. And it's going to be really interesting to see where that goes in the next few years.
Well, like every new realm of technology creates the crises. I heard at a conference recently, a guy showed I think it was New York, but one of the major cities got together and had a panel trying to discuss, because the growth of the city was so great, and horse and buggies was what they used. They said, what are we going to do in 5 years from now? We're going to house and feed 1 million more horses, because that's what it's going to take. And within a year, the automobiles come out. At what the problem we have is we're very myopic, and we're looking at what's the problem I got to solve today. AI is going to solve some of those problems for us. IoT is solving some of those problems for us, and the products that are already have that in their roadmap are going to be the ones that succeed. And obviously the companies that say, "Wait a minute, we need to be prepared for what's going to happen when this happens. We're going to be prepared for how that's going to impact our portfolio," are going to be more successful.
Very true. So let's talk about EBIZ specifically. 2024 is a year that's a very exciting year coming up. There's a lot of expertise that EBIZ has around consulting, around data, around the IWMS products like Tririga, Planon, Nuvolo. What does 2024 look like as the CEO? What are your thoughts on where the company is going to go and focus?
Well, it's first of all, it's exciting that we're finally past 2020 and 2020.1, 2, and 3, where everything kept piling up on the world to say, well, we're not investing in things that don't generate revenue right away. The last 6 months has shown us that we're coming out of that. Either we're coming out of it, or companies are just tired of it and they're going to come out of it on their own. And what we're seeing going recently and going forward is first of all, it reconfirms the reason we were created. There's a lot of interest in technical consulting, but not around the technology, around pure data. And ESG is a big part of that, obviously. But there's a lot of interest in how do we make sure that we're using what we have or what we acquire correctly, and that we're getting good information out of it and not garbage. So that's exciting, and we've got groups that have reached out to us and wanting us to put together just whole programs for them around those topics. But I also think it's an exciting time for the technologies, particularly, again, there's all the technologies that are out there today are good. I mean, there were days when there were 7 or 50 different real estate solutions, and most of those are gone. The ones that are left are good. It's really what is the focus of it. And again, that's a role for a strategist like our strategic services group to come in and say, yes, what you have will work. Let's help you make it work. Or if you're going to replace it, let's help you make sure you pick not technically the best product necessarily, but which one fits in your particular business model the best. Because again, I said earlier, I doubt anyone, when you go through in a selection process, they say, well, I'm going to pick this because it's the best there is. And I remember years and years ago, someone was telling me when every IWMS that was the CAPM tool at the time was coming out with a stacking and blocking module. They said, well, I'm going with this one because it has a great stacking and blocking module. And my first question was, so you do all of that in-house, right? And they said, oh, no, we let the architects do it. Okay, so you're buying a tool because it has a cool module that you don't intend to use. That's the mentality that really the selection process needs to focus on the business processes, the data required to support those, and then which tools will work best for you. You know, it's good enough, instead of saying, well, I got the absolute best, but it won't work with anything else I bought. So that's kind of what we see as exciting. We're getting a lot more interest in can you help us make a decision instead of, I made a decision, can you fix it? Which is kind of what we've seen in the last 5 years.
Yeah, it's a really interesting direction. I think to your point, a lot of companies for the last few years were looking at, well, buying this or doing this is not an investment, it's an expense. But there's definitely a different mentality now, which we need to invest in things like sustainability. We need to invest in being a greener company. And they're seeing the market dynamic shift too. There's a lot of organizations are seeing that. In particular, our younger generation now, they look for people who are sustainable buyers and all. They're looking at those kinds of results. So, and things like data governance are now becoming, I think, more into focus as well. Overall data governance, not just the standards, but how do we treat data across the world? And I know one of our clients is like that. They're a global company, and they're looking at how do we talk about things the same way. It comes back to the simple standards of OSCRE space measurements, but it also comes down to vocabulary. What do we call something when we have a meeting or a conversation? These things are all coming out into play, so we all speak the same language. We all work toward these standards, and you know, EBIZ has a strong focus and a strong track record in that area.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, and you know, it's got enough unknowns because we're coming out of some pretty turbulent times, and I think turbulence is probably a reality going forward. But it is an exciting time because our clients are starting to ESG is obviously a big part of our conversation today, but that is front and center now in everyone's mind, whether they believe in being sustainable or it's just they don't want to get beat up in the market or by the government. Everyone's talking about it. But the other side of it is, how do we maintain things more efficiently? How do we replace assets when it's right and not just because, you know, the clock says we need to? So it is an exciting time. And then if you look at how this whole thing about workplace management, the shift coming out of the last 4 years is, how much time do people spend in the office, and what do we do to make them want to come in? Not make them come in, but make them want to be here.
Right.
What are the advantages of being in a collaborative environment with my peers, and how do I make that space profitable for the company? And that profitability comes from making the people more profitable. So there's that whole industry. And then there's neurodiversity issues in space now. How do we address our space, not for one small narrow scope of people on that spectrum, but for everybody? So all of that, and it all ultimately comes down to process, data, and then the tools that can implement or support them. So we're sitting pretty good place right now, going into the next year, and we're excited about it. This 2023 turned out to be a good year for us, but 2024 is looking like it's going to be, unless there's some new virus or something comes out that we can't anticipate, it's going to be a really good year.
Yeah, it's going to be 2024 is an exciting time. It'll be interesting to see how a lot of these things between AI and sustainability and all the new IWMS changes in the market. It's just going to be one heck of an exciting year. And I really appreciate you taking time out to have a conversation, and Happy New Year. And, you know, 2024 is going to be great, and I'm looking forward to this conversation this time next year to do a recap.
Yeah, the annual CEO report. I do as well. I'm excited about it. I appreciate you putting this series on the map, and I know I've seen the list of topics. I'm excited that after you listen to me rattle, you're actually going to start learning something from some people. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to those of you who have tuned in, and have a wonderful holiday. What's left of it, because you're starting now back, and in the new year. Have a great year.